Welcome to Life Stories. What if your perfect wedding turned into the moment you finally saw the truth? Madison Carter was about to step into a life of power and prestige as Mrs. Kensington. But beneath the glittering chandeliers and grand speeches, a darker reality lurked. A marriage built on illusion. A groom who saw her as nothing more than an investment. And a single moment that would change everything. This is a story of betrayal, power, and a woman who refused to be owned. Subscribe to Life Stories to begin today's journey. Don't forget to hit the notification bell so you never miss an update. The mirror before me reflected a woman the world admired, a woman composed, radiant, and poised for the life she was meant to lead. The dress clung to my body in a way that was almost suffocating. Ivory satin cascading down to the floor, shimmering under the soft glow of the chandelier. It was exquisite, a masterpiece of design, and yet, to me, it felt more like armor than a gown. A symbol of everything I was about to surrender. Madison Kensington. That name would be mine in less than an hour. It sounded regal, powerful, the kind of name that belonged to the wives of senators and industry leaders. But no matter how many times I repeated it in my head, it never truly felt like me. I was born Madison Carter, daughter of Richard and Victoria Carter, a family whose name meant something in America. Not because of generations of inherited wealth, but because my parents had built their empire from the ground up. My father, a visionary in Silicon Valley, had turned a garage startup into one of the most influential tech conglomerates in the world. My mother, equally formidable, had redefined modern art investments, her galleries commanding global attention. Together, they had created a legacy, not inherited one, and yet, here I was, standing in a grand bridal suite in the Kensington estate in upstate New York. About to marry a man whose family name carried weight but little else. Nathan Kensington had everything high society deemed desirable: charm, impeccable manners, and that effortless confidence of someone who had never once questioned his place in the world. He was tall, refined, and well-educated, his features carved in a way that made him the perfect image of sophistication. But beyond the polished exterior, beyond the charming smile that had once intrigued me, there was something else, something that had been growing in the pit of my stomach for months. A whisper that had started soft but was now screaming in the back of my mind. This was a merger, not a marriage. Nathan's family, once among America's most powerful, had been struggling for years. Their fortune stretched thin behind a carefully maintained facade of prosperity. The Kensington estate still stood grand, the towering columns and manicured gardens a testament to what once was, but inside, the cracks were visible, the staff was reduced, the lavish parties fewer, and the investments dwindling. Nathan needed this marriage far more than I did. For my parents, this was an opportunity to expand our family's influence. My mother framed it as a smart match, a union that would bridge the gap between old wealth and new power. My father, ever the pragmatist, reminded me that love fades, but partnerships endure. But wasn't marriage meant to be more than a transaction? I had told myself, over and over, that I was being practical, that it was naive to expect romance, to chase the kind of love that existed in novels and movies. I had almost convinced myself, until last night, when I overheard Nathan on the phone, speaking to a close friend. Madison is exactly what I need, he had said, his voice carrying that same casual confidence he always had. She's smart, successful, perfect for public image, and the best part? Her father's money comes with her. He had laughed then, as if the entire situation was just another calculated investment, another strategic move in a game he expected to win. And that was when the whisper in my mind became undeniable. I wasn't marrying a man. I was acquiring a burden. The knock at the door startled me. My mother entered first, moving with the same grace that had always made her impossible to ignore. Her gown, deep navy with intricate silver embroidery, was only slightly less elaborate than my own. Her hair was styled to perfection, her makeup effortless. She was the embodiment of elegance, a woman who had always understood the importance of appearance. Behind her, my father followed, his presence commanding but quiet. He was not a man of unnecessary words. When he spoke, people listened. He took one long look at me, his sharp eyes assessing me with a depth that saw past the dress. Past the poise. "You look perfect," my mother said, stepping forward to adjust a loose curl near my temple. "Everything is going exactly as planned." I forced a smile. "Of course." My father stepped forward, his hand resting lightly on my shoulder. "Are you ready?" A simple question. But was I? I wasn't. I knew it then, standing there, staring into the mirror at a woman who looked like a bride but felt like something else entirely. I was about to walk into a life that had been chosen for me. Not by me. But I nodded anyway. Moments later, I was descending the grand staircase of the Kensington estate, every eye turning toward me. The air was heavy with expectation, with admiration, with the silent judgment of 100 guests who saw this wedding as nothing more than an extension of our family's legacies. Nathan stood at the altar, waiting. He looked at me the way a man looks at a prize he has already won. His smile was practiced, his posture perfect, but when he took my hand in his, there was no warmth. The ceremony passed in a blur, vows exchanged. Rings slipped onto fingers, polite applause filling the space. We kissed, brief, rehearsed, devoid of passion, and just like that, it was done. I was Madison Kensington now. And for the first time in my life, I wondered if I had just made the biggest mistake of all. The reception was as grand as anyone would expect from a Kensington event. Beneath a canopy of twinkling lights, the estate gardens had been transformed into a scene from a dream. Where champagne flowed freely, the orchestra played softly in the background, and guests moved effortlessly from table to table, basking in the spectacle of it all. I played my part flawlessly, smiling in all the right places, thanking guests for their congratulations, nodding at words of admiration. To the outside world, I was the perfect bride, stepping seamlessly into my new role as Mrs. Madison Kensington. But inside, I felt disconnected, as though I were watching my own life unfold from a distance. As if I were nothing more than a character in a carefully scripted play. This wasn't my life anymore. It was his. Nathan, meanwhile, thrived. He was the center of every conversation, his easy charm slipping effortlessly into discussions about politics, finance, and power. He knew exactly what to say, when to laugh, how to command attention without seeming like he was trying. He was in his element, and he barely looked at me. I found myself near the grand fountain, taking a moment to breathe, when I heard their voices, low, hushed, but unmistakable. "Smart move on his part," one of the men murmured, the clink of ice against glass punctuating his words. Tying himself to the Carter fortune like that. That girl's money could keep the Kensington name relevant for another century. The words were like a slap to the face. But I forced myself to remain still. A second voice chuckled. "He played it well. She thinks she's getting a husband. But he's getting an investment." I turned slightly, just enough to glimpse them out of the corner of my eye. Two older men. Business associates of Nathan's family. Their suits crisp. Their smiles knowing. They weren't mocking me. They weren't speaking with malice. To them, this was just business as usual. And that was what made it worse. I shifted my gaze toward Nathan. He stood across the garden, laughing at something one of his friends had said, his hand resting lightly on the shoulder of an old flame who had always hovered too close. The scene before me was so obvious, so deliberate, and yet no one questioned it. Because in their world, men like Nathan Kensington were untouchable. They were allowed to take, to use, to manipulate, because that was just how things worked. I clenched my fingers around the stem of my champagne flute. My pulse steady, controlled. I had known the truth all along. Hadn't I? This wasn't a marriage. It was a transaction. But Nathan had underestimated one thing. I was nobody's investment. And before this night was over, he was going to learn that lesson the hard way. The night carried on, the reception unfolding with practiced elegance. A carefully constructed illusion of celebration. Guests danced under golden lights, their laughter mingling with the soft strains of the orchestra. To them, everything was perfect. But I knew better. Nathan had not looked at me since the ceremony. Not really. He had played his role well, posing for photographs, whispering affectionate nothings when the cameras were on us, brushing my hand with his in a way that made it seem like we were deeply in love. But I felt the shift, the tightening of his jaw when guests praised my family's influence. The flicker of irritation when someone mentioned my success rather than his. Nathan had always been in control. Always the golden boy, the one with the charm, the name, the connections. But tonight, for the first time in his life, he was losing control. And then came the moment that changed everything. The wedding cake, a towering masterpiece of white and gold, was wheeled out onto the main stage, gleaming under the chandeliers. The tradition was simple. The bride and groom would share the first bite. A symbolic gesture of unity. Nathan reached for the knife, his fingers brushing against mine. His grip was just a little too firm. We cut through the first layer together. Our movements precise, practiced. Another step in the performance we were putting on for the world. The applause was polite. The cameras flashed. And then came the part everyone was waiting for. I took a small piece, carefully balancing it on my fork before lifting it toward Nathan's lips. He held my gaze as he accepted it, chewing slowly. His jaw tightened, just slightly. Then it was his turn. I should have seen it coming. Nathan took a much larger piece. Too large, unnecessary, and in that brief, fleeting moment, I recognized the look in his eyes. The anger, the frustration, the bruised ego of a man who had spent his entire life believing he was above consequence. And before I could react, before I could even breathe, he shoved the piece of cake directly into my face. A gasp rippled through the crowd. For a moment, time itself seemed to freeze. The thick, sugary frosting coated my skin, dripping down my cheek, clinging to my eyelashes. The weight of it was nothing compared to the weight of the silence that followed. No one laughed. Nathan had expected laughter, expected me to giggle, to wipe it off playfully, to continue the act. But I didn't move, I didn't react, I just stood there, letting the moment stretch, letting the full gravity of what he had just done settle over the room. And in that silence, something became very clear. Nathan had just made the biggest mistake of his life. I reached for a napkin, slowly, deliberately, wiping the frosting from my face. And then, with quiet, devastating clarity, I turned on my heel and walked away. The moment I walked away, the reception shifted. It wasn't a dramatic outburst. I didn't throw the cake back at him. I didn't yell. I didn't cry. And that was what made it worse for Nathan. Because silence has weight, people whispered, unsure if what they had just witnessed was meant to be part of some grand joke. But the tension in the air told them otherwise. The music didn't stop, but it wavered, as if the musicians, too, had felt the sharp crack in the evening's perfect facade. I didn't look back. As I made my way toward the grand staircase, I saw my father stand up from his table. His jaw tight, his expression unreadable, but his hands clenched into fists at his sides. If my mother hadn't placed a hand on his arm, he would have moved. Not yet. Not here. Nathan hadn't realized it yet. But his fate had already been sealed. I climbed the stairs with measured steps. The thick silence behind me stretching across the ballroom, wrapping around the guests who still held their glasses in midair, frozen in the aftermath of what had just unfolded. By the time I reached the bridal suite, I knew what I had to do. I stood in front of the mirror, the remnants of frosting still clinging to my skin, the delicate lace of my dress stained with sugar. I had been prepared to play my role, to endure this marriage for the sake of expectations, for the sake of strategy. But I wasn't a woman who tolerated being made a fool of. A knock at the door. I didn't have to ask who it was. My mother entered first, regal as always, but her eyes burned with something fierce, something I had rarely seen in her. My father followed, closing the door behind him, his silence more dangerous than any words he could have spoken. You don't have to make any decisions tonight, my mother said carefully, but I already had. I turned to face them fully. This is over. My father let out a slow exhale. Good. And just like that, it was done. My mother reached for my hands, squeezing them gently. You don't have to make a statement tonight, she said, but tomorrow, when the world wakes up, they need to know exactly where you stand. They would. There would be no damage control, no carefully crafted PR spin. I would not be the wife who stayed. I would be the woman who walked away. Another knock at the door, this time sharper, urgent. My brother. He's coming up here. Of course. Nathan would come. Because this is what men like him do. They push boundaries. They demand explanations. But tonight, he was about to learn that I owed him nothing. The door opened before Nathan even had the chance to knock. He hesitated for a fraction of a second before stepping inside. His polished shoes sinking into the plush carpet. The room smelled of vanilla and orchids. A stark contrast to the heavy scent of whiskey and cigars that clung to him from the reception below. His gaze swept over the room, taking in the scene before him, me standing in the center. My wedding gown still stained with the remnants of the cake he had shoved into my face. My mother, unmoving, poised as if she had seen this moment coming long before I had. My father, standing near the door, a quiet barrier between Nathan and the only exit. And my brother, Malcolm, leaning against the far wall, arms crossed, his stare a silent warning. Nathan had always been good at controlling a room. But this was not his domain. He had come expecting anger. Maybe even tears. Some messy confrontation he could manipulate. Twist in his favor. Convince me to come back downstairs and salvage the night. Instead, he was met with something far worse. Silence. He cleared his throat, forcing a smile onto his face. The same one he had used 100 times before to charm his way out of uncomfortable situations. I came to talk. I didn't move. I didn't speak. I simply watched him, the weight of the night pressing between us. He shifted. Uncomfortable. Nathan Kensington was not used to discomfort. Are you really going to do this? His voice was low, controlled, just a fraction above a whisper. Walk away from this marriage over a joke? A joke. I let the word settle between us. Let him hear the absurdity of it in his own voice. Still, I said nothing. His composure slipped. Just a little. His jaw tightened. This is ridiculous. Madison. It was just a bit of cake. I was playing along with tradition. Everyone laughed. No one laughed. I said, my voice steady, even. The words landed like a slap. Sharper than if I had screamed. Nathan exhaled sharply, running a hand through his perfectly styled hair. Frustration. He wasn't used to being challenged. Least of all by me. So that's it, then? His tone turned sharp. You're going to humiliate me in front of everyone? Make a spectacle out of this over nothing? At that, my father shifted slightly, a movement so small but loaded with meaning. A warning. But I didn't need protection. I had already won. I stepped closer, tilting my head slightly, watching the flicker of something in Nathan's eyes, doubt, uncertainty, fear. This was never going to work. I said softly, and the certainty in my voice made something in him tighten. For the first time in his life, Nathan Kensington had lost. Nathan stood there for a long moment. His jaw clenched, his fists tightening at his sides. He was searching for something, a way out, a way back in, a way to undo what had just happened. But there was nothing left for him to grasp onto. For the first time, he was powerless. I had made my decision. And more importantly, I had spoken it aloud. There was no reversing it. No negotiation. No carefully crafted apologies that could make me forget what he had done. Not just tonight. But from the very beginning. This wasn't about a piece of cake. This was about power, control, respect. And Nathan had lost all of it. Without another word, I turned away from him. There was nothing left to say. Behind me, my father was already on the phone. My mother adjusted the bracelet on her wrist. As if this were nothing more than another business deal closed. Another problem handled. Malcolm smirked slightly, as if unsurprised that Nathan had left without putting up more of a fight. And Nathan? He exhaled sharply, realizing, perhaps for the first time, that he had just lost everything. By the time the sun rose, the world would know. The marriage was over before it had even begun. The Kensington name, once a symbol of power, would now be a cautionary tale. And as I stepped out of the Kensington estate, into the cool night air, I felt something I hadn't in a long time. Freedom. Subscribe to Life Stories for more compelling narratives like this. Don't forget to hit the notification bell so you never miss an update.